Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on what part of the world you're joining from. Okay. So I will just make a few very brief opening remarks and quickly hand it over to the panelists for their perspectives. Each of the panelists will make an opening intervention, and we will then have a round of questions. And finally, we will have a Q&A part where we will have the questions opened up to all the participants. And I request all of you to hold your questions for that particular part of this session. So with that, let's just get into the subject matter. So the past decade or so, we've seen an enormous increase in our ability to generate data, move it around, and process it in various ways. This has been eloquently explained by Professor Moglen in his description of the smartphone being one of the most dense sensor collections ever created, and his characterization of the platform with the parasite with the mind of God. So that's the reality. We're generating a huge amount of data, and some people are being able to leverage that to model behavior. Everybody is also under pressure to upgrade their own data infrastructures to deal with this. So our technology has not necessarily changed as quickly as we would have liked to. And we're still struggling with trying to see how we could manage data. And not everybody is doing a uniformly good job of it. So there is an asymmetry in the capability of people to, or organizations to deal with data, and a tremendous asymmetry between the people and the platform. So this has thrown up very many issues, brought up very many business models, and each of them have their good sides and their bad sides. So that's the context, and we have three distinguished panelists here, and each of them will bring to the audience their own perspectives. So we will first go to Ms. Anita for her opening interventions and her perspectives on this area. So over to you, Anita.
Thank you so much.
Keep your remarks to about maybe 6 or 7 minutes.
Sure. Sure. Am I audible?
Yes, to me, at least.
All right. Thank you. Yeah. So, the session is titled in a very intriguing way, the troubled legacy of data, AI, and platform technologies. What I would like to do really is to really show how this troubled legacy is also becoming rather murky as data becomes critical infrastructure that defines the socioeconomic paradigm. And what I'd like to do is to take and instantiate how we are headed towards a certain dilemma and a kind of a democratic deficit in the governance of data through the example of digital public goods. Broadly, digital public goods are understood as open source software, open data, open artificial intelligence models, open standards, open content, all of which serve as what's broadly understood as building blocks of innovation. And in addition to this, they are also recognized as critical to give impetus to the growth of the economy because they undergird an efficient transition to digitalized governance, which is governance 3.0. They also allow for innovations, plug and play innovations. And broadly, the consensus also is that they mitigate prohibitive costs and vendor lock-ins in terms of in their comparison with proprietary governance solutions, especially for developing countries. But when you actually unpack this narrative, and narrative is everything in the digital world, the example that Professor Moglen gave us of how it's really impossible to shake the belief that the IT industry is equivalent to human progress or growth. And so few people, even 10 years ago, were willing to recognize the kind of deep planetary harm that is perpetrated by certain types of platform models. It's important to anticipate what digital public goods actually can do, will become, and what it is that we really need to watch out for. In a recent paper that my colleagues and I did on this, we actually demonstrate through different examples, and I'll quickly take you through a few examples of how an unrestricted open access approach that misgoverns digital public goods as pure public goods is really at the heart of the problem. This fails to acknowledge and respond adequately to the monopolistic capture of value of such innovations by powerful actors. I don't, of course, to this audience need to define pure public goods, but I would, for the sake of people who may be unfamiliar. Pure public goods are those that are seen to be perfectly non-rivalrous in consumption and non-excludable. So impure public goods, on the other hand, are those that satisfy these two conditions to some extent, but not fully. So what we hold is that digital public goods such as open source software, data and AI commons, they exhibit characteristics of impure public goods. So in some sense, they could be subject to congestion, which basically means that you can't put them out as open and expect that they would still continue to remain non-excludable. They tend to become club goods. So in some ways, there are risks not just of free riders, those who use these open kinds of building blocks for their innovation and abuse, the purpose for which, they were originally created, but what in economics has also been pointed out as foul dealing. Foul dealing is more powerful actors benefiting at the expense of less powerful contributors to the common pool. So essentially, you're not only using the commons for your greed, but you're also kind of making sure that others can't use it. So one example of this is the proprietary software as service offerings on top of, that are built on top of such resource pools. So for example, in 2015, Amazon copied the open source data search and analysis tool Elastic, bundled it with other offerings and made it available as a service on its cloud, AWS, which was a means to enclose what was previously open source. There's also this long story of OpenAI. In 2020, a San Francisco-based AI research laboratory announced the launch of GPT-3, a language model that holds the record for being the largest neural network ever created. The model was trained using the data commons of English language content on the open internet, websites such as Wikipedia and a couple of ebooks. In the same year, that's 2020, OpenAI received a $1 billion investment from Microsoft, and Microsoft granted the technology giant, it took over exclusive license of GPT-3 use. So through OpenAI, this public-facing API, which allows select users to send text to GPT-3 or OpenAI's other models and receive output, only Microsoft would have access to GPT-3's underlying code. So by tying GPT-3 to Azure, which is the cloud services, Microsoft will potentially be able to analyze how different companies use the language model and can also tailor its future offerings accordingly and cement its position as a leader in cloud intelligence. We also hear a lot about the UN managing the data commons as public goods. And the question here is that very often frameworks like Global Data Access Framework, which are created, in which there are multiple stakeholders, including, for instance, an initiative of McKinsey, several technology firms, the UN becomes a kind of a vehicle which allows, in the name of openness and open data commons, a kind of free riding, which then becomes extremely difficult for governments and countries of the global south, who are always and perpetually in the position of being clients to all these multi-stakeholder initiatives. So that there are big tech providers who use these open commons, and then of course they capture these clients or markets in the global south. So before I end, I just want to point to another very important point, which is not just of free riding and foul dealing in this infrastructural commons, but also the fact that multi-stakeholder norm development in these ecosystems fails to guarantee human rights and public interest. So very often these public goods are not managed by public institutions, but they are managed by self-professed, commons keepers, so to speak, who are actually gatekeepers. And a very important example is the modular open source identity platform, which is MOZIP. And the initiative's everyday operations are overseen by a technology and executive committee. And there is a community of private sector system integrators, who bring on board leading firms in the biometrics and digital identity solutions market. And what really happens is that a couple of them have set up another multi-stakeholder initiative based on the MOSIP, and they seek to expand access for private sector players to government clientele, especially in regions such as Africa. And they build customized services on top of MOSIP. So even as market-led innovations have emerged through the partnership ecosystem, of course, from 1 to 70 to 700, the whole question that Privacy International has pointed out is, how do you ensure privacy and personal data protection, data security, meaningful inclusion, human rights compliance, and all of this become really questionable? So to conclude, what I really want to point out is that the whole case and instance of digital public goods or ostensibly public goods leaves open the critical question about public financing. So when you think about the global South, is it enough to create these pools, common pools, leave them the way they are? How does, for instance, overseas development assistance in terms of not debt, but how do countries in Africa, countries in Asia really build these infrastructures autonomously? Now, what will really lead to the genuine sovereignty for the peoples of these regions, and how can national policy really focus on public financing tied to public goods, tied to public standards, really, so that the data commons and the data pools will not be captured by a performative openness that does not lead to genuine, authentic openness. So these are questions for a digital constitutionalism, and I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anita. Thank you for your insightful intervention. And we now move to Mishi. Over to you, Mishi.
Thank you, Professor Oberoi and Dr. Chow for inviting me. And Anita is always a difficult person to follow, considering she covers most of the stuff. But it's a vast field, and also things are always developing and getting complicated. Just like my profile, which is old on my website, I no longer represent Debian or Presafter Foundation anymore. And I continue to practice law, both in the US Supreme Court and as well as the Indian one. So I think it's an interesting thing, considering the examples Anita started with, whether it is the exploitation of Amazon for everything which was licensed under AGPL, or the GPT-3, which became the superstar among the languages, and OpenAI, which at least ostensibly says they're trying to work for all humanity, then does not even open it to everybody for a commentary and restricts its licensing. But the beauty of that commons thing is that you can always fork it and develop something on your own. And that's how the 20th century open source structures were formulated, that no proprietary enhancements. And what we learn is that we do better when we come together. I was a little confused when I saw the title of the panel. Confused mostly because I'm wondering what all is the legacy that we are inheriting. There are constantly developing things, and what ostensibly seems true is actually not even followed in practice. So one wonders, what legacy are we really talking about? I think the popular refrain that data is the new oil, as everybody loves saying it, it's also time to take another look at it. because if anything else, and climate change tells us that burning oil is a one-way process. And we should also think about monetizing of data as a one-way process. I understand that data is increasing value as an economic resource requires a new way of thinking, and strict privacy protections are needed to make socially valuable data available for the public good. India recently released its national data sharing and accessibility policy, and I believe that the public consultation is still going on, and the first round ended last week. The objective, at least from what the policy said, was to facilitate access to Government of India owned shareable data and information in both human readable and machine readable forms. But what's curious is that everything rests about collection and monetization and the revenue models here. I think what people want to do everywhere is to do the same thing that they have tried to do in the last 2000 years in the global economy. In the global economy, when things are very, very hard and cultures are vehemently different, people want to reduce everything to money, because money is the great equalizer. So everyone substitutes monetization for actual agreement about substantive rights, because rights are so hard and market itself looks like a very easy way to figure this out. About market will take care of it. If we start monetizing something, everything will magically take care of it, because substantive rights and talking about all of those multi-stakeholderism is so hard, and we don't come up with structures which we would like. So I see that happening, whether it is in the private sector or coming from the government sector, and some of the conversation even in the civil society about monetization of data and who gets the big piece about it. So we substitute monetization, and we forget that that choice of monetization is also an ethic. I know that ethics are not a conversation anybody wants to have. The People's Republic of China has ethics about everything. So does the current aggressor in Ukraine, and so does the US government as well as Indian government. But that choice is very important from my point of view in terms of where the economics of data goes from now onwards. This ethic, when we talk about monetization, is also called globalization, which has the consequence of turning everything into a cash nexus. If we can put cash value of everything, things would somehow figure it out. Now, one more important point which I want to say is that there is a big difference between data and inferences, the inferences that we draw, as there is a big difference between information and knowledge. The goal of current technology is to enable machines to infer more right now. Whether we talk about machine learning or AI, I think everybody is trying to ensure that machines can infer more, that to make models out of data and to treat those models as a second order object. And this technical reality is doing something which has been around in computing for several years right now. But what we are not able to figure it out is how to convert this information into knowledge. And that's what's the current apple of eye of everybody, from education to media to people who want to control truck drivers. Everyone wants to use the pattern matching software to enable knowledge to be made out of data by inferring. And that is why everybody is concentrating on this bottom layer of data collection. How do we collect that data? Because that will determine how these models will work out. Now, in different ways, different legal structures, different vocabularies, everybody wants to say that we should have commons in data, but proprietary enclosures in inferences. So everybody wants that data to be accessible to everyone, but later on when we come to the inferences, there needs to be proprietary system. And that's what the late 20th century model tells us that is not going to work. Now, I was specifically asked to talk about resolving this conflict between privacy and data sharing. And from my point of view, I don't think that we can even begin to talk about between this conflict if we don't establish at one end of the spectrum that a citizen always has a right to say that I'm always out. So if I am the citizen, I must always have the right to say, I don't want to be part of any of these systems, I'm opting out. And that should not impact anything that I do as a citizen, whether it is paying taxes or going about my business, living my life the way I want to do. So if I don't give that right to the citizen, then we can't do anything. Let us assume that we have the policy structures, the legalities, and the technical requirements that says that no citizen is required to compromise his or her equality in any way of civil economy, social life, political economy, by giving up information if they want to keep it to themselves. If I just want my information to myself, then I should be allowed to do that. And my rights and exercise of my rights should not be taken away. And if we don't do that, then this conversation doesn't even actually start. Once you grant that there can be that kind of opt-out, a strong enough opt-out that you can be an equal citizen to do everything, once you have done that, then we can actually take the next step over. There has to be a full opt-out, doesn't have to say, and if we agree on that part, then I think the next thing just follows from that, because there cannot be a full opt-out if I am not entitled to store my own data. Now, so I'm a citizen and I want to do basic things, but I also want to just opt out of the system, and the state or the private sector should not be able to come and tell me, oh, you can't file your taxes, you can't do X, you can't do Y, because your information is now not being collected. The second thing which follows is that if you're going to allow that, then you also must give me the right to store my data the way I like it. And that does not mean that the state decides how my data is stored. I should be entitled to keep it in any storage and not just Indian storage. So it's all under my control. My data could be under my box, under my bed inside a Freedom Box, or in a cloud storage service, which is based out of Switzerland or anywhere else of my choosing. So to be a citizen of a country should not mean that my data has to be collected for monetization by Indians or kept only in India. My rights have to be bigger than that. And if we want to address the crisis between privacy and data sharing, we will have to accept that there has to be a way to opt out of the system altogether. And there has to be a way for people to designate where they want their data to be, which isn't necessarily in one particular country, in our case in India, as the rights are broader than the rights to be monetized by Indians. I think understanding privacy as the right only to be monetized by my government or government designated agent who's living in India is not to understand the idea of privacy at all. And the right to be left alone is not an adequate definition of privacy either, but it certainly is a necessary one. Beyond that, the right to privacy in a technologically sophisticated society, such as the one such as the two societies I keep moving between, the Indian one and the American one, is to say that all supposed rules for compromising between privacy and sharing have to be what is it to have privacy actually is. My data, my choice has to be just like my body, my choice. I appreciate the idea that we don't even have full control over our own bodies, and that's why this becomes a complicated conversation. But hard things are hard, and that's why we are on this platform to talk about it. I'll end my opening remarks on that.
Thank you, Mishi. What a wonderful intervention. And let's now move on to Professor Anupam. So Anupam, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sundeep. Thank you, speakers. I was thinking how to frame my intervention, and I came to the conclusion that it's best that I talk about the thing I know best about, which is AI. In conversations like these in the policy sphere over the last 3 years, generally what I have noticed is that there is very little talk about the instrumental aspects of AI. Generally, the conversations flow around concepts which are rooted in legal, constitutional, political, economic philosophy. Instrumental bits about AI are ignored, and I think that is a problem because it allows for a large degree of mystification by those who would oppress you. And sometimes the mystification is so successful that even people who think that they are creating frameworks to resist that sort of thing, they end up accepting its priors. I'll give one small example. Recently, I was talking to an organization called IFF, which does excellent work in privacy. They had done quite a lot of good work in monitoring how facial recognition tech is spreading across India, and they wanted to talk with me. And at some point, the conversation veered to the idea of auditing. They asked me that is it possible to like audit AI, and is it possible to understand why an AI system does the thing it does? And I said, no, it's not. They said, what if we sensitize the engineers? What if we insist on transparency? I'm like, no, you're not getting it. Physically, it's not. You can have the best possible engineers. You can have the best possible regulations crafted by the best people in IEEE, and you can care about fairness, accountability, transparency, ethics, human rights, all of that thing. But it doesn't matter because it is a thing which is by design non-transparent at a certain degree of sophistication. B, it is a thing which is by design stochastic. You can't have not stochastic machine learning. That's not a thing. So when Professor Moglen used the word God, I would like to modify it a little bit. A drunk and a blind God. God with immense power, but a God which is fundamentally arbitrary. I think this is something missing from our conversations on governance of AI, in the sense that we all think that it is governable, in the sense that we all think that, oh, we can reduce the bias, we can make it explainable, we can insist on fairness. No. In certain use cases, the thing has to be banned. And not just banned because it goes against normative ethical principles we hold dear, but banned because the thing is not as advertised. The thing does not have the sort of power which we have started to take as natural priors. This idea that the thing can give us insights which can be useful in, for example, policy making or governance, that is a dangerous prior and it's completely inaccurate. And I think this comes out of a lack of conversation between policymakers and AI scientists. As somebody who crossed that bridge, the very idea of using machine learning in policymaking is comical to anybody who knows their craft in AI. I'm sorry, but we laugh at policy discourses when they say things like, oh, this data set is biased against minorities. Why do you use it? We use it because it's beyond my pay grade to care about it. If I'm an AI engineer in a company, I don't give a fuck about bias reduction. I do what my manager tells me to do. It's called capitalism. Please read about it. Like this idea, like techno-solutionism has become very interesting because it flows both ways. And we have only recognized one, the more obvious one, that technology can't solve all problems. Granted. But there is the other way of thinking as well, where one thinks that one can make policy making, the locus of it, regulating that technology. We have to understand that some of these things are because of bad politics. In some of these things, these technologies should not be used, period. And these struggles in the policy sphere of trying to regulate them, or to make it even more diluted, trying to regulate the data and completely ignoring the use case itself. Because you could have the most unbiased, transparent facial recognition technology, and I would still militate to ban it, regardless of which police jurisdiction uses it. Because I would say that A, it is stochastic, arbitrary, and arbitrary things should not be used to govern people. And B, that at the end of the day, a thing like this is extremely data hungry. You will violate privacy of people. It doesn't matter what you want to do. It doesn't matter that you have the correct political priors, etc. If you are going to use these things, you will violate the rights of people. There is no other way around it. And hence you must not use these things. My bias here is that I believe that states are not independent, detached entities floating over societies which get to make decisions from above. Rather, I believe that states are joined at the hip with whoever is powerful in societies. And if we are going to be talking about tech monopoly, states right now have every reason to be joined at hip with them. And since states are like that, hence how they govern need to be monitored. And governing with machine learning tools is an extremely bad idea because of the way these technologies work. It does not matter if you want them to be, for example, audited, because the thing is not auditable. It does not matter if you want them to be democratic, because the thing is fundamentally non-democratic. Fundamentally non-democratic because, well, whether it be a bunch of volunteers somewhere or a profit-making company somewhere else, which is making the thing and collecting the data, then they get to decide policy making when they get to make the thing which controls policy. Democratic AI is possible, not the sort of nonsense which open AI and all these things are claiming, because of course they are not democratic. Actually, democratic AI is possible, but that would require a complete transformation of how the political economy of our society works. It would require a complete transformation of how international trade works. And I, for one, am not a utopian. I'm not going to wait till imperialism ends, until international trade ceases, and till data transfers all end. Till that point, what I would do is to militate against the use of these technologies in policymaking, in governance, in the public sphere. I'm not an abolitionist. In fact, I am an AI scientist. I love AI, and I would really like it if it is used in ways which is liberatory and which is beneficial to people. But I also believe that AI does not exist in a vacuum, that the technology is not the locus of politics, that everything which surrounds it is. And because that everything that surrounds it is where the battle lies and not the technology, till those things are sorted out, trying to insert AI in governance is extremely, I hate this word, problematic. I generally like to be more specific. The debate of whether data is a commodity or not, the debate on what the nature of data is, becomes kind of moot within capitalism. Whether you want to recognize it or not, data is used as if it's a commodity by people who control it, states and companies both. And that stopping that sort of becomes the central point. I would go 3 steps ahead and say that large collections of data should be avoided out of principle, that incursion of machine learning tech in any public use case should be banned unless utility is proven otherwise, which it will not be proven if somebody who knows what they are talking about actually interrogates it properly. Unfortunately, in the very real world we live in India, that is, things are nowhere near this. We have, for one, completely no data protection law, and we also have really no legal instrument to prevent, for example, government officials from using machine learning tech in every use case, including, scarily enough, many police departments, and private companies sort of doing continuous function creep and invading policy making, and we now have smart cities and all that. This thing has gone beyond not understanding a fundamental nature of a technology and using it in a way which reifies oppression. That has already happened, but this thing has gone into complete snake oil territory. There is a vast market within AI which is pseudoscientific, which does not work, but then no AI really works. But this is based on priors which are not real. It's called emotion detection. Emotion detection is not real. Emotion detection has about as much merit as astrology does, or computational astrology, if you want to do that. And yet there are states, there are consortiums of industries, there are campuses which do AI research, which have poured in the amount of resources, money, attention into emotion detection, which is scary. The person who invented the area of effective computing, fraud, has 70,000 citations. This sort of things do happen in AI and will happen again, because these things look lucrative to an economy where you would rather the democratic decision making process not exist. You would rather that welfare not exist. You would rather that people who are governing you do the barest minimum for society. In such a scenario, the very idea that you can have machines which can give you knowledge about internal states of human beings is very attractive to people who make money. One of the most disturbing things I have been researching on recently, for example, is people using natural language processing bots for mental health therapy. Slightly comical. I mean, in the scale of evil, this is nowhere near the large evil sort of things, but like a good example of where we are heading with like small snake oil usages streaming out into the public sphere. I do not agree with this dichotomy of state versus private. I would rather look at things in terms of who has the power to build wealth versus who doesn't. And in that sense, state and private are pretty much the same entity if you really think about it. And that entity has every incentive needed to keep pushing AI in public governance. That needs to be combated. If anybody thinks that they would like to be present in this policy debate, I think it becomes their duty to ceaselessly combat it. That would be my very polemical, biased, vulgar, surface level intervention. I am sorry for basically giving a speech, but thank you, Professor Oberoi, and everybody in the panel.
Thank you for that very sobering intervention, Anupam. And we, just being mindful of time, I will just put one question to each one of the participants, and I request you to just take no more than a minute and a half to give us your perspective. So going first to Anita, can you tell us a little bit about India's public data sharing approaches? So what is the state of play there?
Yeah, I think Mishi gave a very, very eloquent submission on that. But broadly, I think since this minute and a half, I think we really need to look at two kinds of data. One is data that is already in private enclosure, as Mishi put it, in the form of inferential insights, what one could call digital intelligence, what Anupam called AI. But then there is, of course, the data that is supposed to be a public good, which is the open government data. So the debates in the world oftentimes urge the government to open up public data sets. This is in the name of innovation, in the name of the economism, the whole idea that data will lead to growth. And of course, all of us are in this race. Yet, there will certainly not be anything that is mentioned about data vis-a-vis private enclosures, right? So this, I think, is really a non-starter. And in the Indian context, of course, we really don't have a law for personal data protection. And there is a policy, of course, on that was submitted by an expert committee on non-personal data. The key problem with this is the silences. But one thing needs to be said, that in its data sharing, India really adopts an approach that also goes in the direction of monetization, which Mishi spoke about. In terms of the recent draft that is out for public consultation, which is government to government sharing. The whole idea is, and government to private sharing, the whole idea is alienation, which is basically that there has to be a de facto commercialization of data. Secondly, the whole centralization without a federated governance of data. So these, I think, are blind spots that plague the imagination of data sharing. One thing that must be also put on the table in my last 10 seconds of the 1.5 minutes is that the Non-Personal Data Committee does look at how you can break up private enclosures. And it may be instructive to look at pre-existing models in the world. For instance, in Germany, for instance, in the insurance industry, there is a mandated data sharing. We have to remember one thing, that this do-gooding about voluntary data sharing is not going to happen to create these common pools of data. Private industry has no incentive. So I think we really need to grapple with this question. Thank you.
Thank you, Anita. Here, this is a question for Mishi. So, Mishi, given your extensive legal background and your experience of practicing in the courts in the US as well as India, does the substantial absence of data-related regulation in various geographies concern you? What is your opinion?
Well, I think it's mostly like when we started early on about data collection, everybody just loved everything. 2007, I was a student for the first time when I wrote about data collection on Facebook, and everyone thought that I was a little wet blanket, a party pooper, really not having fun with what great things social media could offer. It's the same thing when we started talking about data collection early on. Nobody thought about the nefarious aspects of it. Now we are here where we are being told that data regulation or something like data protection, you call it the CCPA coming from California, GDPR, or if Indian government ever gets around to doing actually any work on this one, the Data Protection Act. These are going to solve our problems. I will say this thing, that obviously courts are very different based which country we are in, but right now the interests are so far apart from all the stakeholders that these conversations seem not to be really going anywhere. In India, facts are being made on the ground, and each time you talk to the private players, they'll be very quick to say, once the Data Protection Act is there, things would actually look different. That is just one small aspect or the part of a privacy framework which exists, in which also we are not putting people at the center. What we are putting is data at the center. Every time the importance is about data and not about the people to whom it impacts. When Anupam was talking about this, I was thinking about Zachary Lipton, who is also a professor at Carnegie Mellon. And we were together in something, and he said, everyone who's serious in the field of AI knows that all the things about explainable AI is nonsense. And this is to Anupam's point about the experts who worked in there also do understand that the buzzwords have a role to play. The buzzwords are to raise money, to create enough buzz so that private players can actually make facts on the ground. And later on, the regulators are told everybody is doing it. Now it is so difficult to roll it back. And that's what's happening. In the United States, only after the midterm, a national legislation on privacy will be discussed. In India, we keep going back and forth between what the government's powers are. Indian government has always had two major problems. They don't understand what ease of doing business is. The Chief Justice of India just now said, everywhere I go, they want to ask about ease of doing business, and I guarantee them independent legal opinions, judicial thing. Everybody laughed about it, including the people who practice and are officers of court. India does not know what ease of doing business is. Singapore does. That's why most businesses are running now away from India, and they want to do it because the problem is we rely a lot on criminal punishments, even for businesses. The second thing is we don't come up with light-handed regulation. We come up with very heavy-handed regulation where every time the regulator through rules wants to intervene in everything. That is not good for business because business likes predictability. That is not good for citizens because citizens don't understand where their rights actually are. And we try to do a mishmash of everything. So we don't have anything basically. In your thing, you talked, there's this specific thing about facial recognition tech that is also different everywhere else. Europe is discussing it. Some states in the US have complete moratorium on using facial recognition technology right now. There are 3 pending acts in the Congress. This 4th Amendment is not for sale. There's Facial Recognition and Biometric Technology Moratorium Act, and one more about government ownership. India, the Home Minister said 2 years ago, they were already using facial recognition tech to identify protesters. It is moving so fast and at such breakneck speed that we can't even talk about all of this. We always know that regulation is 2 steps behind technology, but in India, things are moving at a pace where government just does not want to be controlled at all. There is no judicial oversight, there is no parliamentary oversight on Indian surveillance, and government doesn't want to be regulated. Now we have reached a place where government collects data and then shares it with private parties. We saw it during COVID. Arogya Setu's privacy policies were pretty much up for debate as well as in litigation. So I will say is that the problems are so intricate and so intertwined, but the only way to look at them is to put people at the center of it and stop talking so much about data, whether it is good for government or it is good for the private sector, because everybody will have a reason to say it's good for certain reasons. And I will come back to what I started with, that the individual's rights have to be bigger than that. And whether it is you're trying to do content moderation using certain models of tech or anything else, at the end of it, if we cannot protect people, then we are all just trying to make cumbersome rules and regulations to make it possible for the fat cats to make money and for the powerful to make deals with them and for us citizens to sit on the sidelines and watch.
Thank you. And a quick question for Anupam. What are the very specific ways in which governance frameworks for AI and the data that feeds this AI should look like? And what are the specific ways in which this is different from governance frameworks for other kinds of technologies?
So, like I said, that there are certain technological realities of machine learning which can't be wished away. Every technology has affordances, error measures, etc., etc. Even a motorboat will have errors. That's not the thing. But the thing which makes AI different, or rather machine learning different, is that it is stochastic, which means that it is founded on probabilistic models. You can't wish that away. And there are large sections of AI usages which try to ignore that fact, and these usages are AI usages in the public domain, in this whole public-private nexus, which spills over into governance, law enforcement, etc. My personal opinion is that these should be outright banned. These should be, like, of course, the state wouldn't want to stop using it, so people will have to, policymakers will have to lobby, people will have to politically agitate, political parties will need to make this a thing worth public debate. But they're like that thing that, you can't like wish away this fundamental aspect of AI, that it's stochastic. That needs to be the basis of regulating it, that because it is like so, there are things it should not be used for. The second very AI specific things, as opposed to like governance for digital infrastructure in general, is that machine learning has this insane appetite for data. This seems to be something people again have this utopian thing that, oh, we can somehow control it, or we can somehow obtain that data ethically, or we can somehow simultaneously make these large collections of data but also not violate the rights of people. Not going to happen. I think that there is this sentiment in certain Indian tech circles, NASCOM, etc., that GDPR is too harsh. I would say that if anything, GDPR is extremely full of loopholes and too easy. That at the end of the day, if these collections of data are allowed to build, then there is no way to then having people find usages, which then you will have to be fighting on the back foot. With facial recognition tech, Mishi is absolutely correct. We are already like 50 steps behind. Recently, a friend of mine, Vidushi Marda, wrote this paper on Delhi Police's collection of data, which they use for various machine learning things. And it is very clear that, at no level of the bureaucracy is there any concern at all about where the data comes. Recently, there was collection of video and biometric data of using sensors attached to the bodies of sanitation workers in Panchkula in Hyderabad. Again, people went, asked the bureaucrats, they didn't even know who had created the whole AI infrastructure behind that project, where the data was being stored, etc., etc. But they did find the idea useful, even if its usefulness was extremely in question. Ultimately, if you are going to create these things, people will invent usages for them in their head. It doesn't matter whether, at that point, whether you can successfully argue that these things don't work. They need to be stopped at inception. And the argument beneath that can't just be moralistic. It needs to come from a good understanding of what AI is and why it is not like any other digital infrastructure. There are a lot of other things we could also go into, like how AI, for example, enables platforms, which Professor Moglen was talking about, because without machine learning, you can't have the sort of infrastructures which these tech monopolies are using and which they are using to constantly expand. Without machine learning as a whole ecosystem, you can't have the sort of perversity which Amazon Turk is. You can't have these click farms. You can't have this whole feedback loop of one side of platform workers who are not considered workers, but whose job is to collect these vast amounts of data. And on the other side, the machine learning, which makes governing these platforms possible in the first place. So there's a whole other policy debate which we could go through, that why AI is helping create a sort of economy which none of us probably want, that is different. And getting into that right now is probably going to be too complicated. I will leave that for another day. But the things which should be stopped right now, they are also very clear. And there is enough instrumental reasons to advocate that those things not exist. That would be my answer.
Thank you. Thank you, Anupam. So, with a quick observation that in the early days of radioactivity, radioactive baths were considered good for health. And we soon learned otherwise. So with that observation, let's just throw the floor open for questions. So just raise your hands and I'll call out in the order in which I see them. So we have PK with the first question. So go ahead, PK.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. That was informative in a lot of sense. However, my question is open to all, anybody who can actually answer this. And it stems from the fact that most of the data or a huge chunk of data is already available on the dark web, or the dark net as we call it. And the people putting over there are the people from the organizations themselves. So I find a flaw in the policy itself, and the policy, in my own belief, cannot address the problem of individuality, where the people themselves are indulging in sharing the private data on the dark web. And I find it that there can't be any solution to this kind of a problem. Even if you try to plug one hole, you cannot do for the entirety. For instance, I have actually come across this database of Zomato and the credit card companies all lying at $10 or $100 on the dark web, and as recent as maybe in the month of Jan and Feb. So how do we tackle this? And if there is no way out, then the entire discussion seems worthless in that sense. Yeah.
Maybe you could take some questions together,
Yes. Okay. All right. So that was one question. What do you do about the fact that lots of data is being pumped onto the dark net is available? If we can't stop it, it's meaningless. Okay, let's go with Varun. Varun, what's your question?
And please also let us know your background, if you're from inside or outside IT.
Thanks, Dr. Oberoi. This is Varun from NASSCOM, and this was a question to Anupam actually. So could you, because we heard a lot about how AI shouldn't be utilized for policy making for a number of reasons, but you also mentioned that there are use cases where positive outcomes are possible. Could you explain what such use cases look like, particularly for somebody from a non-technical background, so that we can get a better sense of when AI is actually useful, since we do know a lot about when it isn't?
A quick question to PK. Would you just briefly introduce yourself?
Yeah, I am from Center for Policy Studies in 5th year.
Okay. And let's have Abhishek's question as well.
Yeah. Hi everyone, and thank you for a very wonderful talk. So basically, my question is why everyone is so concerned about privacy? Because privacy can be dealt with certain things like pattern learning and all that. Data can create more problems rather than privacy. So that's my question.
Okay, so to the panelists, just please feel free to jump in, pick up any of the questions and address them. There is one that's specifically addressed to Anupam, but I think
if you want to make it easier for others, I can address it very quickly. So I believe it was Varun, right? There are a lot of use cases of AI which in no way impacts governance of people. If you are going to use machine learning to predict when will the next locust swarm attack a piece of farm somewhere in Karnataka, that is an extremely good use case. If you are going to use machine learning to complement if you do it in a rigorous enough manner, certain areas of prediction in astronomical, geological, medical, chemical sciences, if you are going to use machine learning to find new drugs. There are good use cases and I would say attractive use cases which have nothing to do with the governance of people. So I kind of find it very strange that national policies on AI seem to consider governance, coercion, surveillance sort of as these central things to debate on, whereas there is a lot of stuff out there using data which has nothing to do with either people or their rights or their economic rights or any of that. And even, you know, then you can also think about there is this secondary use case, like suppose there is data which does not come from people but is impersonal data of some sort which comes from communities. Suppose the data of traffic of a city, right? Already you have companies which use such data to sort of figure out how their, for example, platform, which a certain exploitative platform which does not consider its employees as employees, it figures out how to navigate its vehicles. A city could, with a democratic mandate, keep that data for itself, figure out that problem using machine learning, and improve public transport. There are imaginations of AI which A, will not affect at all governance of people, B, can be used for their benefit as individuals and as communities, and will not touch their personal data or their rights, etc. And there are enough Bhatere use cases, and we can think about them. I think that is something which the state needs to proactively think about, rather than you know, trying to govern people or make policy through AI, which should not exist. I could answer, like I could give a try in answering the others, but I would rather that the other two panelists do, because they're much better at data issues.
Mishi, Anita, do one of you want to pick this one up? That look, if people are going to dump data on the dark web and we're unable to do anything about this, then is all our policy making going to be effective?
Well, that question proceeds with an assumption that you do have a system that works, whether in law or policy. I think when you were asking that question, you said, then the policy is really not working. And I'm sorry to inform you that there's just one law, which is called the Information Technology Act in India, and which has sections which sometimes if you were to go and talk to the certain person, they will say, oh, we have everything they laid out. The first time I started talking about Data Protection Act, I was told Section 43 of IT Act addresses everything. And I'm like, so what exactly are you doing about it? Which is zero. The Software Freedom Law Center, SFLC.in, which is the law, tech, and policy organization, which I found and works in India, is right now fighting a case on behalf of a plaintiff against the Computer Emergency Response Team of India. And what have we told them? If you know, from 2020 to 2021, there were 5 data breaches: Big Basket, MobiQuick, Domino's, Air India, and one more which I can't recall right now. And nothing was done about it. And then we sent a legal notice to Certain to say, what exactly are you doing about this? And I will say Certain's response was, Certain is aware of its responsibility and does not require your client's directions to investigate data breaches as highlighted by you, which is basically very much about Indian bureaucracy. Don't tell us what to do. We know it better. Go away. Why are you even asking about your rights? So we went and told them, okay, if you're not going to do your job, then we'll have to ask the court to tell you to do your job. We'll see where that case goes. You know how things are. So what I'm going to say is that there are several layers to the answer to that question. But the cheap, simple answer is there is not a system which currently exists right now where we can actually go and address that issue. However, there are certain policies which do exist for corporations where they do have to ensure that such kind of data breaches by their employees is punishable. Now, if India is going to be the outsourcing center, and I have a client in Europe, which is a real thing, my client is not going to be feeling very comfortable with India as a place where they can share that data. I will say this, that there are a lot of accounting firms and insurance firms in the US, 2 of them current clients in the US, who want to outsource data, and they're asking for assent from us. And we are very nervous about the fact that data is going to be shipped from here to India. Now, the problem is that there are 2 ways, because there is no real law here and no clarity. There is no dedicated agency or of the government which looks into all of this, and certain doesn't even want to do its current job, let alone more work. Nothing is really going to happen here. But companies have created 2-layer structure. If they're catering to some foreign company, they are different. When they're catering to just Indians' data, because there is no repercussion, it's not going to happen. If you're asking what is already released and if we can turn it back, that obviously becomes a much more complicated thing. And there are ways you can address some bits about your own data. And I think there was one more question about why are we talking about privacy so much when it's all about data. I will say privacy means a lot. And what we are talking specifically in this conversation is about information privacy. And information privacy is the relationship between collection and dissemination of data and what our expectation of privacy and legal and political issues are. There are definitely other aspects of privacy which are not covered by information.
So we are actually absolutely out of time, but Asif, if you will, ask a very short question. Don't make it a speech, make it a short question, and we'll get one of the panelists to give a short reply. And we will end on that note.
I'm Asif from, I'm doing my MPhil from HSS department. So my question is directed to Professor Anupam, but others can also reply. You talked about emotion detecting AI. I've come to know that is also used in measuring the performance of workers, especially in the BPO sector. And the Safai Karamcharis in Panchkula and Asha workers in Haryana were also made to install certain softwares in their phones without proper consent. The proposed PDP bill allows employers to collect performance-related data. So, how do we tackle this issue? Given that, one more thing is that the employers also cut their salaries considering the performance. So, how do we tackle this issue considering that most of these employees are in the highly unorganized sector, especially the BPO employees, and what is to be done?
What is to be done is to loudly and repeatedly insist that emotion detection is astrology. It is not collecting anybody's, it is not having any insights on anybody's performance whatsoever. It's a terror mechanism to silence workers and prevent collective action. Keep repeating that loudly and irritatingly and obstinately at every policy platform you are at. And then hopefully get people out on the streets to keep yell and go to the courts and yell the same thing. And essentially there is no answer to it aside from saying it's fraud. It is fraud, and you can't I don't have a complicated answer to give you. It doesn't work. It is fraud. All its claims are wrong, and you have to keep insisting that. There is really no sophisticated policy answer for something which is fundamentally snake oil. It is snake oil. Insist it's snake oil. Insist in front of powerful people it's snake oil. Keep repeating it's snake oil and hope that some politician somewhere thinks it's enough of an election issue to make an issue out of it and then, actually does something about it. So that would be my answer. I hope the other panelists have smarter answers to give on this, but that's literally what I can say.
I think we really do have to conclude this session. It was an excellent session. Okay, many important points brought out. Okay, where Anita brought out several important facts on how things that are open suddenly not remaining open any longer. Okay, and Anupam has brought out these issues on things that AI should absolutely not be used for. And Mishi has made many insightful comments and interventions on the nature of privacy itself. And we've had lots of questions, lots of interest.